Hey everyone, Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Terry Mesnard, and we're talking about Finders Keepers, which is the second Bill Hodges novel. Terry, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I'm really excited to talk about this one because this is one, unlike some of the books that I've covered with you, this is one that I had not read before.
Okay, yeah, I hadn't read anything from this trilogy prior to this podcast. It's funny, I actually read the Holly Gibney story that's in If It Bleeds before I ever read any of these novels. And
Oh, really?
I had watched The Outsider as well because I usually want to be like part of the conversation. The only thing I've missed out on recently is The Stand because I was like, all right, that's coming up soon enough to where I don't want to watch it and then watch it again like 4 months later.
That is one you do not want to watch again because let me tell you, that was not a good adaptation.
Yeah, I waited for like the first few episodes to see what my friends were saying, and I was like, I'm going to wait on that. And I did the same thing with the Dark Tower movie. I was like, nah, we're not doing that.
Yeah. Now I had read Mr. Mercedes when it came out, and I really
Okay.
enjoyed it. And then when Finders Keepers came out, I did read like the first 20 pages or so, and then I got sidetracked and I never went back to it. So I'm really excited to have finally plowed through it. And I had of course read The Outsider and seen the series, but yeah, I'm excited to continue my adventure of Bill and everyone.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually got The Outsider in the mail today. It was like the last Stephen King book I didn't have on my shelf. And I was like, okay, the collection is pretty much complete. I do not own Cycle of the Werewolf, but I have read it. So, that's okay. That one's a little harder to find. I think they've since reprinted it. But for Finders Keepers, this is one you can kind of find anywhere at this point. These went crazy what King Book doesn't, honestly. When he releases one, you can find them in like Walmart and Sam's Club now and stuff. But
Yeah, you can find it
Finders
everywhere.
Keepers, I thought took a very interesting approach in comparison to Mr. Mercedes because Mr. Mercedes really focused on this one big crime, but you have the back and forth timelines with Finders Keepers, and it still ties into the story of Mr. Mercedes in a way that maybe you wouldn't expect. Did you enjoy that aspect of this?
I actually really did. In fact, the first third of the story, where it's kind of setting up a contrasting narrative between Morris, the kind of thief that ends up killing his favorite author, in like in the 70s, and then in the today's time with Peter Saubers and his father, who was of course one of the connections is that he was at the job fair that Mr. Mercedes in the first book tore through. And there's interesting connections here. I really like the way that King sort of established Peter's father getting run over by a car, and then you also in the past have this kind of horrific sequence where Morris, the villain in this book, runs over one of his fellow thieves. And the way King describes it, where there's a muffled pop, the sound of a small pumpkin exploding in a microwave oven, is one of the most like gross descriptors I have read in a very long time, but it also felt so fitting because you could just visualize what the sound that made. But King does this thing where he sort of sets up Peter and Morris as sort of like foils to each other, two kids that really enjoyed this author and started to get to know their own selves through reading it, but then they take two drastically different turns. And so the first third of the book, I was like, where is this even going? But it really worked for me.
Yeah, I was like, oh, they're going back in time? Okay, wait. What's going on here? And this one maybe took me a little longer to get into than Mr. Mercedes did, just because I was kind of trying to figure out what King was attempting to do with the story. And I do love that he doesn't keep things the same. I haven't read End of Watch just yet, but it's coming up next for me. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing how it kind of wraps up with that one. But with Finders Keepers, I was like, okay, now that I got into it, I really enjoyed it. And the thing I've noticed between Mr. Mercedes and Finders Keepers so far is that these are very quick reads. And I don't know if it's just because they are detective novels that don't have quite as many ties to the rest of the Stephen King universe. You still get mentions of things here and there in these two novels in particular, but At the same time, it's not something where you have ties to the Dark Tower necessarily or things like that. Those kind of connections that might be a little harder to make, but you still have this element of we understand who these characters are, where they're from, and sort of what's going on in their life. And these stories have been way more grounded, I think, than some of King's other stories simply because they don't have this supernatural horror element to them in the same way that a lot of his novels do.
Yeah, and I can understand maybe not getting immediately pulled into the story, although I kind of had the adverse effect where I was instantly into this because I love the way that he was kind of weaving these two stories together. And it was by the time that everything got caught up that I wouldn't say lost interest, but it didn't hold my interest as much as this early section did because I really enjoyed seeing the connections between the two characters. And it's a kind of a thing that Pete himself brings up a couple times throughout the novel where as he starts to learn of Morris, he's afraid that he is Morris or that he will become Morris one day. And so I really kind of like that this early character building where King actually lets us get sort of into Morris's head and in some ways kind of feel sympathy for him. You're right that this feels a lot more grounded than some of his books because there is a lack of supernatural element. But the thing that really I as much as like I think Morris is a terrifying character because of his superiority complex that's like hiding his actual inferiority complex. The plight with his mother in particular kind of also tied me to Mr. Mercedes with Brady's relationship with his domineering mother. And it kind of made me kind of feel sad for this character, even though he is one of King's kind of most horrible like human characters I've read in a while.
You felt that way with Brady too in Mr.
Yeah.
Mercedes, or at least, I did, and the people I've talked to about the novel with have felt that same way. And with these characters that he's writing, he's giving us the worst of the worst without adding that extra supernatural element to it. So it's not like they're becoming Pennywise or something, or there's something like the Overlook that's making them this way. Instead, it's just, no, these are terrible people. And because of how real it is, that's what still makes these stories so terrifying. And the fact that Peter's a kid, I mean, granted, he's in high school, so he's a teenager technically, but really, he's still a kid in comparison to someone like Morris. And you just have absolutely no idea how it's going to play out. We know that there's a third Bill Hodges novel, so we know he's going to be fine. By his definition of fine, I guess we should say. But really, you don't have any clue how things are going to play out for Morris or Peter and his family right away. And there are some twists in this, like when he takes Peter's sister and you have the fact that she's friends with Jerome's sister, and it just kind of ties everything in so nicely without feeling forced. But when Morris takes her, you're just like, oh no, we have no clue how wrong this could possibly go.
Yeah, and the thing that kind of I kept thinking about in particular was Morris is an interesting character because he's someone that King has kind of explored somewhat in other books. There's this idea that King has established in at least three, including this novels that I know of, where there's a relationship between the author and their fans. And so you have Morris, who is on the surface a fanatic for Rothstein and his work. And King kind of creates Rothstein as almost like a kind of popular author, like the way Stephen King could be perceived. And you have him sort of loving the way that this character is written, but then when Rothstein takes the character on his path, all of a sudden he feels protective and he feels ownership over that character, and so that rage that develops that then continues throughout the entire novel, where he kills Rothstein because he said he made him feel stupid, and he thought that he took this character that was amazing and just threw it in the garbage from his perspective. That kind of anger building up through the years that he's been in prison. Yeah, by the time we get to him kidnapping the sister, it's like, are they going to make it out alive?
And to dive into Rothstein a little more, over the years, you have to imagine that King has angered some people. I have been fortunate enough to just read every book one right after the other, pretty much. Sometimes I will slide in reads that aren't Stephen King books in between, just for a little bit of a break. But I didn't have that excruciating wait between Dark Tower novels, for instance. And, you can only imagine that some people didn't like the way that King has handled certain characters, or, even maybe when Dr. Sleep came out and you're doing a sequel to something 40 years later, and it's hard to please everyone. And Rothstein is the ultimate victim of that, because he's just a guy who wants to be left alone and write his books, but fans sometimes will think that creators owe them something, which I've never really understood. It's like, I watch a lot of superhero shows, a lot of the Stephen King adaptations, obviously, for this podcast, and there are things that I don't like, but I'm not going to, go into a rage over the fact that there are two Shining adaptations and I feel one way about one and one way about another, but it's something where there's just something that clicks in someone's head and they're like, oh, this is owed to me. And I don't know what makes them that way, but with Morris, you really kind of dive into that psychology for his character in this. And even though the murder happened so long ago, having Peter find those notebooks, it just allows you to revisit that and revisit Morris's thinking as soon as he's out, which I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go back to that idea that you were talking about with that entitlement that some fans have, because honestly, as I was reading the part where Morris actually steals the books from Rothstein, and he starts like demeaning Rothstein, saying that you're a hoarder, you don't have a reason to publish these, so you're never going to because you're making so much money from all this other stuff. Like, he just gets in his face that he feels owed, that the books that Rothstein has written and hoarded away are his and that he deserves to have them. And as I was reading this, I was actually thinking in particular about the way some fans have reacted to like George R.R. Martin, where, I've read all of his books, and, there's a point where he hasn't written anymore. And some fans have like latched onto this, like, oh, you're never going to write this again, or even worse, you're going to die before you even get to write this. So like, there's that entitlement and that anger that I've seen bubbling up online that I do think Stephen King was trying to make a point with this character by kind of taking all of the negativity that people have thrown online, whether that's through the Dark Tower, because it took King forever to write that, and it kind of took a near-death accident for him to finish it, and also other authors in his ilk like George R.R. Martin that don't write things on their fans' desired timelines. And so I was thinking about that a whole lot as I was reading that entry part, that early part.
Yeah, and King is a big proponent of putting writers into his stories, and it makes sense because every time he does it, it's not like he's sending the same message necessarily. I have honestly felt that he's sending a different message every time he puts a writer in his novels, and this is definitely one of the more powerful ones that's kind of directed towards fans. And I'm sure you and I both know a ton of amazing, amazing Stephen King fans, or, fans of anything else, whether it's Marvel or DC or what have you. Just these huge fandoms in general, there's always going to be both sides of that. And I really think this was like, you know what, this is for you entitled fans.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this also recently because I'm currently watching the Lacey story on Apple TV, and that is another story of his that sort of centers around an author passing away and leaving unpublished manuscripts, and the way that of certain fans are attached to it. And when I was looking up information about that, it's also kind of relevant to this. He has said that he's had his share of stalkers. There was an interview with him where he was talking about this guy that broke in, who was from Texas, and was convinced that somehow he had stolen this guy's his aunt's idea for Misery. And all that they heard was Tabitha heard glass shattering downstairs, and he came down to see that this man was holding a package that he said was a bomb. And so, like, he's had these experiences, and I gotta think that I forget how old King is now, but he's probably had a ton of these kind of moments in his life that are kind of terrifying, because at the end of the day, he's a human being, and there are a certain contingent of fans, regardless of who it is, not just King fans or George R. R. Martin fans. You
Right.
can look at like superhero fans. There is a contingent of fans that take that love of something a bit further.
Yeah, it's certainly one thing to kind of be obsessed with these things. And, for me, I've had to be obsessed in order to get this podcast done. You can't do a weekly Stephen King podcast and just be like, it's all right. So for me, reading Finders Keepers, I was like, okay, he's definitely wanting to get this message out to a certain type of fan, whether it's his own or fans of other things, because, I'm a fan of a variety of different things that maybe most Stephen King fans might not be in the same way, because there are people who love horror and maybe they don't really love a bunch of other genres. But for me, it's just, I love a bunch of things. So it's like always on for me. It's like whether it's Star Wars, Pixar stuff, Marvel, DC stuff, Stephen King stuff. I read, Image comics and things like that. And there's just so much out there that for me, I don't want to linger on one thing too long if I don't like it. Like, if I didn't like the Tommyknockers, okay, who cares? Some other people like that book and that's great for them. It's not my thing. Neither was the adaptation. And I've accepted. I'm like, okay, maybe I don't like Stephen King's Alien stories, quite as much. And that's okay because, well, one, in the grand scheme of things, his Alien stories only take up a few books. They're present in the Tommyknockers, Dreamcatcher. Under the Dome, I liked a lot more because of how much it focused on the town. But, we're reading detective novels now, and I've watched so many procedural shows over the years because that's what my parents watched when I was growing up. So some of them just kind of stuck with me. So this book is like hitting that love of this kind of detective story for me and still giving us enough horror because of how realistic and how terrifying these characters have been, especially with Brady and Morris. And, to dive into the story a little more, you have Peter finding these notebooks. He's kind of trying to help his parents get out of this tough spot. They get mystery money coming in, and Peter is really just putting the entire weight of his family and their financial problems on his shoulders without telling anyone. And you see him start to realize, oh, I'm in over my head. And, what teenager hasn't realized that at some point? I guess maybe some haven't, and that might be a problem. But for Peter, he has the best of intentions, really. And you see that struggle within him. And I just love that part of the story so much, too.
I do too, and it kind of ties into what we were talking about with Morris, because like I mentioned earlier with Peter, that he's afraid at a certain point that he is kind of going to be Morris at one point. The difference, and this is what I think is interesting about the way Stephen King structures this, well, the beginning of the novel and then also the rest of it, is that Peter could never be Morris because Peter has empathy, and Peter kind of represents this other side of the fandom because he loves Rothstein, loves the books. They mean so much to him. They mean as much to him as they do to Morris, but he sees something different in it. And I was thinking that if the situation was reversed and Morris found this trunk with this money, he would not be sending anonymous stuff to his parents to try to help them out. He would be hoarding this. He'd be keeping it for himself because at the end of the day, he's a narcissist, while Peter is one of the most empathetic characters that King has written in a while. And so I love that he is sending this money anonymously to help keep his family afloat. And I love that the reason why he gets into more trouble is not out of like some need for self-validation because he found these books. It's because his sister can't get into this expensive school, and he wants to do good for her. He wants to do good for his family. And it's that empathy that really differentiates the two of them completely.
Right. And I also enjoy the fact that he takes his time to read through the notebooks, and it doesn't hit him right away. Oh, hey, these are these notebooks that someone stole years ago when they killed this author, because that was way before his time. And it even takes a while for Bill and Holly and Jerome to make that connection there. So the fact that it wasn't like, oh, hey, this is super obvious to all of the characters right off the bat, it gives you these moments where you're like, okay, what's going to happen here? Because we know what's going on, but the characters in the book don't. And I love when you have information that they don't, and you get to see how they figure it out.
Yeah, I did really like the fact that we know, okay, this book, and if you lay out the plot from beginning to end, it's pretty simplistic.
Yeah.
Honestly, and especially if you strip out the first third, where it's literally about a boy that finds a trunk that has a lot of money and some notebooks. He goes to try to sell the notebooks. Bad guy comes, attacks his family. Like, that is the basic plot point of the last 2/3 of this book. But because we know all the plot going in, and then it introduces the wrinkle of finally introducing. I was surprised at how long it took for them to introduce or reintroduce Bill and Holly and whatnot and Jerome. But by the time they introduce them, the way it kind of takes on this detective novel where we have the dramatic irony because we know everything that's going to happen and we know everything that has happened, and they're trying to put the pieces together, kind of made an interesting connection there. And what I really liked is there's a moment where Holly is like, you can kind of see the gears shifting in her mind as she's like, there's something here about these notebooks.
Yeah.
She just doesn't know what. And there's one moment where she almost could have avoided all of this because she's like, I want to go talk to the teacher. Maybe I'll wait because there's no reason for me to do this because I'm just working on a hunch. But if she had followed suit on her gut, a lot of this could have been avoided in the beginning. And I love that because it puts us going, oh, Holly, you almost could have saved it. It's such an interesting way that he frames the detective story. And it's an inverse of the detective story because typically we're following along with the detective and trying to solve the case with them. Whereas here, we know what's happened. We know what the problem is. We know what the stakes are. They don't.
At first, it felt like they did take too long to introduce Bill and Holly and Jerome again. And, after sitting with the book once I was done and just talking about it now, I'm like, no, you know what? That was the right move. Because if they would have inserted their storyline to catch up with Bill and Holly and Jerome, it would have been way too much at the beginning. They needed to set that expectation with Morris and Peter first. I say they, but it was King, and build on that. This way, we know what the stakes are before Bill even gets involved in the case. And then you're like, okay, so we know what the stakes are. Bill, Holly, and Jerome are all kind of figuring it out. And then we get to see how it plays out, what their moves are, how they're going to solve this problem. And I think it does ultimately work in the end. I think, because it is quite different from how Mr. Mercedes was told, it's kind of hard to compare the two, like a one-to-one comparison. If he had just written this one the same way as he did Mr. Mercedes, that would have been much easier. But each of these books has something, at least so far, that's uniquely their own.
Yeah, I agree. And, I do think if you were to look at it from a pure plot perspective, I do think Mr. Mercedes is a more interesting plot because there's a lot more twists and turns with it. There's a lot more kind of detective intrigue, whereas this one, again, is kind of simplistic in its narrative structure. And I kind of knew where things were going by the time, the bookseller gets involved. And I did think it was cool the way that King kind of structures this situation is sort of like a car crash that we see kind of coming in the distance and are unable to stop. But what I think this one does a lot better than Mr. Mercedes is by focusing on so much on the early start with the character, where you actually get into Morris's head for literally a third of the book. And and so I do think that the focus on the character is a lot stronger in this one, whereas maybe the plot is a bit more simplistic.
Yeah, I think so too, because even though he does the same sort of thing with Brady, where we dive into his character a lot psychologically, it's just done in a different way here. And, you know, on the note of Brady, we can't fail to mention here that Bill has been visiting Brady, and that kind of brings the whole thing full circle for all of the characters involved. You have what happened to Peter's father, and you have the fact that Morris is tied to the bookstore owner. So even though those two characters aren't tied to Brady in any sort of way, you still have this story coming full circle for both of your main characters with Morris and Peter.
Yeah, and I also love I have not read an End of Watch, but from what I've heard is that it might introduce a little bit of supernatural edge to it, and you can kind of this book kind of establishes that a little bit where when Hodges goes to visit Brady in the hospital, and Brady's a vegetable, or supposedly a vegetable, and he's staring out the window, but like he keeps knocking over the picture with a
And the water
uniquely
keeps turning
king,
on.
yeah, with the clack sound. And then by the end of the book, one of the nurses has killed themselves, and of course that was what he did in the first book to I can't remember what her name was. Was it Olivia? There's a character from the book that he kind of makes her kill herself out of guilt.
Yeah, Olivia, I believe, the owner of the Mercedes.
Yeah, and so they're kind of establishing. I feel like this book is establishing the next what's going to happen in the sort of finale of this trilogy, and it does it in an interesting way because it also shows a little bit more character from Hodges. Is that he's equally obsessed. Like this is a book about obsession. It's Morris's obsession with this writer. It's Peter's obsession with the writer as well, but also with doing good for his family to disastrous personal ways. And then it's also Hodges is unable to let go of this killer and visit him in the hospital. So it all kind of ties together thematically, but then it also does a really good job, I think, from what I've heard, of setting up the third book.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that one other than the fact that it is sitting on my shelf waiting to be read.
Well, and I also kind of going along with the obsession thing, the way that the Morris dies at the end of this book, where he's literally burning himself alive, kind of brings to mind the idea that of like self-immolation and the kind of religious fanaticism that religious fanaticism that turns into that sort of self-destruction, where he needs to have these books, and in a way he wants to become part of it by grabbing up these ashes in this burning pyre and self-immolating. It's horrifying, but then I also find it a little sad because he's going to die without knowing how these books are going to end, and how this character kind of gets quote unquote redeemed. The character that he's obsessed with in the books that Rothstein wrote kind of redeems himself. And it's because of his fanaticism and his obsession with it that he ends up dying before he even can know how the story ends. And it's sort of kind of tragedy. I mean, of course he's an evil character, right, and he's a horrible person, but there's a sense of tragedy to that.
For me, it kind of paralleled when we find out what Brady's relationship is like with his mother. You know, obviously that is terrible on a whole different level than, you know, this guy not getting to read books for so many reasons. But it gives you that moment of sympathy for the villain of the story. And even though you don't like Brady or Morris at all, you just have that fleeting moment when you're like, oh, I feel bad for this guy, but also he sucks. So I don't.
Yeah, and there's a moment earlier in the book too that I felt the same kind of sympathy pangs for him, and it's when he's having I think he's in jail at this point, and he's having a flashback to when he was younger, and he had the books on his shelves, and they were his special books, and his mom, she kind of sneaks into his room and takes them and reads them, and the only reason she reads them is to belittle him and belittle his favorite book, and so there's this scene where he walks in and the books are sitting on the table, and he is just like, he feels like part of himself has been invaded by his mother, who is constantly haranguing him for not being who she wants him to be. And there's this conversation, but you can kind of see the hurt in his eyes that she is literally just saying that, no, this character in this series of books you're reading is stupid. And it's not until the third book, the book that you hate, that he's even showing a modicum of that the writer is showing a modicum of talent. And that's upsetting. And that was a moment where it's like, I can't imagine my parent coming in and just reading my books for the sole purpose of just demeaning my interest in them. There are these moments that King kind of sneaks in where it's like a little jab of like, yep, this isn't just, a faceless evil character. This is a human being. And yes, he is a horrible person and does horrible things, but there are moments of tragedy with him, just like with what he did with Brady.
It's also a little easy to forget how old Morris is because he's so threatening. You kind of think of him as this younger character, and we know that's not true because they basically tell you, this dude is 60, but he doesn't really move or act like someone who is 60. Usually people are kind of like mellowing out around that point in time, and you really get this feeling that he just has this rage inside him that he can't contain, and it's amplified as soon as he sees the notebooks even. And there are a few things I want to mention about Peter's family still, but Morris is probably the most interesting character aside from Peter in this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think King has outdone himself with creating a character that is equally terrifying and also sad. And what I think is interesting is the way how much we get to spend in his head about how he sees society. And it's like I kind of I mentioned this a little bit earlier about his superiority complex, but there is a part in the book where he is talking about how he can make kids laugh even though they don't like him. And he's like, but that's okay because they're dead enders. And it starts this paragraph of him saying that, they're dead enders heading for dead end marriages and dead end jobs, and they'll raise dead end kids and dead end grandkids, before coming to their own dead ends. Like, he continues on this whole tirade about how everyone else is inferior to him. And he says that Morris was meant for better things. And so it's this idea that he kind of lords himself over them, and we get to spend so much time in his head that it is frightening. And he is I think he is probably the most interesting character in this book. But I am curious what you wanted to touch on with Peter's family.
So we haven't talked about his parents too terribly much. We mentioned that, Tina was taken by Morris and she's friends with Barbara, who is Jerome's little sister, but his parents are so focused on their problems. It's kind of like, not that they don't care about their children, because they clearly do, and that's why they're so focused on, getting out of this terrible financial situation, because the dad is, on disability and things like that because of what Brady did. But it isn't until very late in the book when the mom figures out what's going on. And I really like how you can tell that this light bulb is just like going off in her head, and she's like, oh no, uh-oh. And then by then it's too late for her to really confront Peter about it, to do anything about it before Morris shows up. And you feel bad for her because you're just like, oh, you finally figured it out, and they're just going to crush that dream of yours to, work this whole thing out with your family. And obviously they do get to do that by the end. And, Peter's doing that photo shoot and things like that, and everything's all well and good by the end of it. But they have to go through so much collective trauma as a family to get to that point where the mom's like, oh, it just hit me what's been going on.
Yeah, and I don't remember exactly why I thought this, but I think there are little sections of the book where it almost kind of insinuates that maybe she or his father kind of knew that maybe the money was coming from Peter, not really, but they didn't want to like address it because it's a $500 paycheck that's coming every month or so, and it's helping keeping them afloat. So I do think that there's that sort of pull where they probably know that this money isn't just coming out of the goodwill of some random stranger, that it's probably coming something closer to home. But if you kind of interrogate that, then there's a chance that it will just go away, and they need that money so bad. So I did think it was kind of funny the moment that, she finally is able to address it and she calls him and he's basically saying, not now, Mom, I can't talk about this. She's like, it's $20,000. Why can't you talk? He's like, no, you just gotta trust me. There's someone coming to the house. Be careful. And so it's the moment that like, their kind of relationship switches where it's kind of switched through the entire thing where he's kind of been taking care of his parents. But at this moment, that power dynamic is certainly, out of whack, where it's the mom's like completely in the loss as to what's going on. And the son is trying to, again, save his family from certain death.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier too how simple the plot is. And I think there are a lot of King books that honestly have really simple plots when you sort of sit and break them down. And so many of them involve writers because, write what you know, like I said. But for you, was there anything else with Finders Keepers that stood out in particular? I honestly just like how King is able to take such simple plots and make you just so intrigued by the characters, and you sort of just can't help but fall in love with some of the characters, or you just vehemently hate them.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that, it's the thing that makes Stephen King's books interesting when you kind of strip away the plot, which tends to be, as we both said, kind of simplistic. And a lot of times it's the way he writes his characters and the way he is able to explore the way they're thinking about everything. And it kind of elevates what could be, a B book, or just sort of like that kind of typical horror novel that you read as on the beach to pass time. It kind of elevates it to a different level. Now, I do have a problem.
Okay.
And I have to bring this up because it bothers me when I see it. It bothers me that the way that King, in this book in particular, and in a couple books, uses queerness.
Okay.
In this book in particular, he kind of relies on two tropes. One, the moment Morris gets into prison, the first thing that happens to him is he gets sexually assaulted. And that becomes a thing that is continued throughout his first stay in there. And it's the reason why he ends up getting a job in the prison to get protection. And so we're seeing this idea of assault with two male characters. And that is one trope that is constantly used. And the other one is this idea, and this one is a little bit brief, and probably most people just sort of skim over it, but the way that Andy, his Morris's friend, who is also gay, who turns into his enemy,
the bookshop owner.
The bookshop owner. There's one line when Peter walks into his bookstore. There's a line, and I made a note of this, where Andy is saying that he might still be attracted to the occasional young male. And he's thinking about this the moment that a 17-year-old comes in. And so this is, again, it's a very small part, but it's also a line that sort of that infers that Andy is a predatory gay, which is another trope we have seen in horror fiction and thrillers throughout the history of both books and in cinema of the last 60 years. And so because we only see this aspect of queerness, it kind of bothers me, because there's unlike the way of Morris and Peter being like two sides of fandom, there is no other character that is a good or someone that kind of redeems this trope. So instead, it's pretty much all about violence and the threat of violence. And that kind of bothers me.
I totally get that. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I was on someone else's podcast recently talking about the females in the Stephen King universe. And, he has certainly done a better job of being more inclusive in recent years with his stories in what types of characters we see. But he still falls back on a lot of tropes a lot of the times. And, the jail scenes were kind of reminiscent of Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah.
And you have seen these things used before. Whereas, with Shawshank, that's taking place in a very, very different time period. Granted, this crime, the initial crime, I should say, happened back in the 70s, but from my understanding, that's not the crime he went to jail for. So it took a little longer for him to end up in jail. So even given that time period when he first arrived in jail, you're kind of like, okay, we didn't need you to do this. This had no real impact on how terrible of a character Morris is, because we already know what he's in jail for, and you get that whole thing play out, and that would have been enough alone. And then, you have the inclusion of Andy, and you have that moment, like you said, which I did notice that. It didn't stick with me quite as much because I was like, okay, that's kind of weird, but then I just kept reading. So I'm glad you brought those up, because Andy can be a criminal without being that kind of criminal.
Yeah, and I think I think it kind of what probably clued me in a little bit more and kind of bothered me a little bit more is the fact that Andy sort of, I mean, he's not a good character either. He's not a good person. He is a thief. He is a scoundrel. He is, even as much as he doesn't want to admit it, he did sort of nudge Morris in the direction of going to kill Rothstein. Of course, he, can throw back his nose. Oh, I didn't mean you to go do all of that. And he can play, the innocent card, but we spent a little bit of time in his head, and we can see that he is equally selfish, equally narcissistic. And so when you add that on the only gay character in the book, other than the sexual assault that happens, which you don't know the sexuality of the person doing it, because as everyone knows, sexual assault is not about sexuality, it's about power. So you have that, and then you also have this character, and there's no foil to it. And so, people are going to rely on tropes, and it doesn't necessarily bother me a whole lot when I see some tropes play out, but if there's no counterpoint to it, and it's a thing that is constantly brought up in fiction, it starts to grate on my nerves, and it makes me sad to see when this was written, in 2015, or published in 2015,
Yeah.
to see that still continuing on in the 21st century as a trope.
Yeah, it is really unfortunate, and hopefully we'll see some more diverse characters in a different light for King in future books and things like that. And, we mentioned that man is pretty old now. So, hopefully we still have quite a few more books left in him. But
I hope so.
I think, like I said, he has done a better job of including certain characters in his novels, whereas before you wouldn't really see those characters at all. Or if you did, it was still very similar tropes, like in It, for instance, and you really just would love to see more progression on his part, because we know he has progressed as a person throughout all of these decades that he's been writing. So it would be nice to see the characters do the same.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Terry, I think that probably wraps up our thoughts on Finders Keepers. I do like to do ratings. I actually just bumped this up to a 4 out of 5. I'd like this pretty much just as much as I liked Mr. Mercedes, but for different reasons. So I'll be very excited to see how End of Watch plays out. But for you, where would you put this on a out of 5 scale?
I mean, I was thinking 4 out of 5 as well. I think the plot in this is not exactly his most well thought out in terms of twists and that kind of thing. It's very A to B to C, but I think the fact that we get to spend so much time with the characters and get to learn, get to be in their head, and I think the way that the first third is structured, I think this is a book that is all about the characters, and it's those that I'm going to remember more so than who does what to whom. And so I do think that this is a 4 out of 5 for sure.
Awesome. Anything you want to plug before we go here too?
I just want to say that if you are listening to this when it airs, there is I'm doing a fundraiser for the Transgender Law Center. It's this thing I do every year, and this year we chose to do this fundraiser for this organization. And so if you're interested in reading works by a bunch of queer horror fans that are writing criticism and writing articles and stuff, and if you want to help donate, please go to gailydreadful.com, and you'll see where you're able to to donate for this life-saving organization.
I'll be sure to have a link for that for the listeners in the show notes. Terry, thank you so much for coming on today to talk about Finders Keepers.
Thanks for having me again. It's always a joy.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.